There is a kind of guilt that does not come from visible mistakes, nor from actions that others can point out. It arises quietly, within the mind, fed by thoughts that repeat themselves, accumulate, and find no rest. Billy Graham observed this kind of inner weight with great attention, a burden that does not come from what was done, but from what is continually thought and silently relived. This is a reflection on that inner guilt that forms within one's own thoughts, and that many people carry without realizing when it began. This inner guilt usually has no clear origin. It is not tied to a specific mistake or an obvious decision. Often, it arises simply from the habit of overthinking oneself. Thoughts return, analyze, question, revisit old situations, and construct scenarios that no longer exist. It forms when the mind begins to function like a constant courtroom. Every memory is reviewed. Every word spoken in the past is re-evaluated. Every choice is placed under suspicion. And little by little, the person begins to feel indebted to themselves, even without knowing exactly why. What is most silent about this conflict is that it requires no external action. Life goes on, responsibilities are fulfilled, conversations happen, but inside there is a persistent feeling of owing something, not to others, but to oneself. A vague impression that one should have thought differently, acted better, been a different version of who they were. Many people live with this guilt without recognizing it as such. It disguises itself as self-criticism, excessive reflection, an attempt at personal growth. It seems productive. After all, thinking about oneself is often seen as a sign of awareness. But when these thoughts find no rest, they stop clarifying and begin to weigh heavily. This guilt also draws no external attention, because it does not visibly change behavior. The person remains functional, responsible, present. The conflict happens in silence, in a space no one else enters. It is there that thoughts accumulate and begin to build an increasingly demanding internal narrative. There comes a point when the mind stops merely reflecting and starts demanding. Small thoughts arise, almost imperceptible. I should have done better. I should have noticed sooner. I shouldn't think this way. And even when there is no direct accusation, there is always a sense of insufficiency accompanying the reasoning. This guilt is not born of major failures. It is born of repetition, of the constant return to the same thoughts, of the difficulty in letting the past rest, of the attempt to control through the mind something that can no longer be changed. Billy Graham observed that many carry this weight without ever naming it. They simply feel a constant restlessness, a difficulty in feeling at peace with themselves. There is no obvious crisis. There is only an inner wear that grows as thoughts become the main arena of conflict. And the more a person tries to resolve everything through thinking alone, the more this cycle strengthens. The mind becomes the place where guilt feeds itself, not because something is wrong, but because there is no space to interrupt this continuous flow of inner judgment. This is the central conflict, living trapped in thoughts that never rest and, without realizing it, allowing a silent guilt to arise from them. A guilt that does not ask for confession or immediate correction. It simply settles in, repeats itself, and accompanies the person as life continues normally. Billy Graham observed this kind of guilt with a perspective very different from what usually appears in moral discourse. For him, the most persistent guilt was not necessarily the one that came from visible actions, but the one that slowly formed within the mind, when thoughts became a constant space of self-demand. He noticed that many people live trapped in an inner dialogue that never quiets down. They think about the past, revisit choices, analyze intentions, and without realizing it, begin to measure their own worth through this incessant mental flow. Guilt, in this case, does not emerge as an external accusation, but as a weight gradually built by one's own conscience. Billy Graham understood that the human mind has a natural tendency to seek control. Thinking is a way of trying to organize life, make sense of experiences, and correct what has already passed. But when this movement finds no limits, it stops bringing clarity and begins to generate wear. The person starts living more inside their own head than in their own life. For him, this inner guilt was often confused with responsibility. The person believes that by constantly thinking about their mistakes, failures, or decisions, they are being mature, aware, attentive. But Billy Graham observed that there is a subtle line between awareness and mental imprisonment. When thoughts do not cease, they stop guiding and begin accusing. This process, according to his view, does not happen abruptly. It settles in almost imperceptibly. One thought leads to another. One memory pulls an interpretation. An interpretation generates an inner judgment. And over time, the person begins to carry a constant sense of insufficiency, even without being able to explain its origin. Billy Graham did not see this as spiritual weakness or a flaw of character. He saw it as a sign that the person had lost contact with the necessary inner silence. When the mind speaks all the time, there is no space for inner rest. And without rest, any thought tends to become heavier than it really is. He also observed that this guilt is rarely shared. Because it is born from one's own thoughts, it feels too intimate, too difficult to explain. The person feels it, but does not know how to put it into words. And so they keep it, they move on, they function, but they carry this silent weight. In Billy Graham's view, the problem was not thinking, reflecting, or evaluating one's own life. The problem arose when thought became the only place where the person tried to resolve everything. When there was no space for pause, for listening, for interrupting this continuous mental flow. This form of guilt does not shout. It does not accuse out loud. It simply accompanies. It is present in moments of silence, in unexpected pauses, in the instance when the mind slows down and lets slip what had been held back. It is this understanding that makes Billy Graham's perspective so precise. He did not offer condemnation nor easy relief. He simply pointed to the fact that a life lived entirely inside one's own thoughts tends, sooner or later, to produce an inner weight that is difficult to sustain. In modern life, this inner guilt finds room to grow with almost no resistance. The fast pace leaves no time to process one's thoughts, but it does not silence them either. They remain there, active, passing through tasks, commitments, and conversations. The mind does not stop, it only shifts focus. The day begins with expectations. What needs to be done? What should have been done before? What is still missing? Between one activity and another, thoughts return, often bringing comparisons, inner demands, constant reviews of one's own behavior. None of this needs to be conscious to have an effect. Repetition is enough. Billy Graham observed that when life becomes excessively performance-oriented, the mind begins to evaluate everything in terms of right and wrong. Even simple thoughts gain weight. The person starts judging themselves not only by what they do, but by what they think. And this creates a level of demand that is almost impossible to sustain. Routine helps mask this process. There is always something to solve, someone to respond to, somewhere to be. Constant movement gives a sense of control. But inside, the mind continues to accumulate unresolved thoughts, and with them a diffuse guilt that is hard to locate. At work, this guilt blends with productivity. Thoughts like, I could have been better, I should have thought differently, I shouldn't feel this way arise naturally. Not as major accusations, but as small internal phrases that repeat throughout the day. Modern distractions also play an important role. They do not eliminate thoughts, they only postpone them. In moments of pause, the mind returns with even greater force. Silence, which could bring relief, begins to be avoided because it brings back this inner dialogue loaded with self-demand. Billy Graham saw that many people live trapped in a constant self-surveillance. They evaluate feelings, question thoughts, and try to internally correct everything that passes through the mind. And in this continuous effort, they end up turning their own thinking into a source of guilt. This guilt does not stop life from moving forward. On the contrary, it adapts to the modern rhythm. The person works, produces, relates, but internally, they carry the feeling of never being completely at peace with themselves. There is always something to review, something to correct, something to think through again. And perhaps you recognize this in simple moments. A small decision that generates hours of reflection afterward. An ordinary conversation that is replayed over and over. A passing thought that turns into a reason for self-pressure. Not because it is serious, but because the mind finds no rest. This is the modern form of inner guilt. It does not come from major failures. It is born from excessive thinking in a world that does not teach how to stop. And the more life demands quick answers, the less space there is for the mind to find silence. In this context, guilt stops being a momentary feeling and becomes a constant background, a discreet but persistent presence that accompanies the person as they continue doing everything they need to do. There are moments when life lowers its volume. Tasks cease, conversations end, lights go out. It is in this space, where almost everything stops, that thoughts become clearer, and with them the guilt that had been contained throughout the day. Silence does not create this guilt. It merely removes the distractions that had kept it dormant. When there is nothing to occupy the mind, thoughts return to what was left unresolved, to what was said, to what could have been different, not as a clear memory, but as a persistent sense of self-demand. Billy Graham observed that many people avoid this silence without realizing it. They fill every gap. They seek noise, screens, any stimulus that prevents the mind from returning to this inner dialogue. Not because silence is dangerous, but because it reveals what was being avoided. In the early hours of the night, this process intensifies. The body asks for rest, but the mind remains active. Thoughts arise uninvited. Small flaws are magnified. Intentions are questioned. And little by little, the person finds themselves trapped in a mental flow that cannot be interrupted. This guilt does not present itself as a clear accusation. It appears as discomfort, as an unease that does not resolve, as a difficulty in simply being present with oneself. The person is lying down, but feels there is still something to resolve within their own mind. Functioning on autopilot helps during the day. At night, it comes at a cost. Silence demands a presence that the tired mind can no longer easily sustain. And then, thoughts become more demanding, more repetitive, more charged. Billy Graham saw this moment as a point of revelation, not because it brings answers, but because it exposes the cost of living in constant inner dialogue. When the mind does not rest, even ordinary thoughts begin to carry weight, and that weight turns into guilt. Nothing needs to be interpreted in this silence. Nothing needs to be corrected. What arises there does not ask for analysis, only recognition. Silence does not accuse. It simply shows what has been accumulated over time. There is a sense of suspension in this space, between one day and the next, between what has passed and what is yet to come. It is there that inner guilt stops hiding behind routine and reveals itself as part of the very flow of thoughts. This moment resolves nothing. It only reveals. And perhaps that is why it is so often avoided, because looking at this weight requires stopping, and stopping is not always easy in a life accustomed to constantly moving forward. When this inner guilt remains unrecognized for a long time, it begins to change how a person perceives themselves, not abruptly, but gradually. The mind starts filtering its own experience through a constant standard of judgment. What was once just thought becomes a reference for evaluating one's own worth. Billy Graham observed that this kind of guilt creates a silent wear. A person does not necessarily feel wrong, but feels that they are never entirely right. There is always something to review, something to adjust, something to think through again. This feeling does not stop life from moving forward, but it weakens inner confidence. Over time, mental guilt interferes with how life is perceived. Small mistakes gain disproportionate weight. Achievements are quickly dismissed. The mind fixates on what could have been different, and, little by little, the person begins to relate to themselves from a place of lack, not presence. This process generates a very specific kind of tiredness. It is not just emotional fatigue, but an exhaustion of consciousness itself. Thinking becomes heavy. Reflecting no longer brings clarity. The mind remains active, but no longer offers relief. Billy Graham saw that many people in this state begin to distance themselves from who they are. Not out of indifference, but out of excessive self-demand. Being with oneself becomes uncomfortable, and so the person seeks distractions, commitments, anything that helps avoid this inner encounter. Ignoring this guilt does not eliminate it. It only reorganizes itself. It may appear as irritability with no clear cause, as difficulty in feeling genuine joy, as a persistent sense of inadequacy, even when everything seems to be in order. This guilt also affects how time is experienced. The past is constantly revisited. The present is rushed through. The future is anticipated with worry. The mind rarely rests in the now, and without that rest, the experience of being alive loses depth. Billy Graham understood that this wear did not come from moral failures, but from a prolonged inner imbalance. When thoughts become the main space of conflict, life begins to be lived under continuous tension, even if silently. None of this needs to be dramatized. It is not about collapse or an obvious crisis. It is about accumulation, a weight that grows little by little, and because it does not interrupt functioning, ends up being normalized. This deepening offers no answers. It simply shows the inner cost of living trapped in thoughts that never cease. A cost that does not appear externally, but that slowly shapes how a person feels about themselves. Perhaps the guilt that is born from one's own thoughts is not something that can be resolved all at once. It forms gradually, through excessive reflection, through the silent repetition of ideas that find no rest. Recognizing this does not close the subject. It only opens space to notice how the mind has been inhabited. Billy Graham never treated this kind of weight as something to be eliminated in haste. For him, understanding what is happening inside is already an important movement, not to correct immediately, but to interrupt the automatic cycle of inner self-demand. Perhaps you still do not know what to do with this guilt. Perhaps you do not need to decide right now. Some reflections do not ask for a conclusion. They ask only for continuity. A more attentive look at what insists on returning when the mind slows down. It is possible that this video has not brought clear answers, and that is intentional, because guilt that is born from one's own thoughts rarely dissolves through quick explanations. It asks for time, awareness, and space. I suggest that you subscribe to the channel. If these reflections resonate with you, subscribing allows you to continue accessing content that follows this same rhythm. Human observations, silence, depth, and Billy Graham's ideas applied to inner life, without haste and without formulas. If you wish, leave a comment. It can be a short sentence, something you noticed about your own thoughts, or just one word that summarizes how this theme touched you. There is no need to explain much. Perhaps the most important thing is this: not to end the reflection here, to allow it to continue with more attention to what happens within the mind and less judgment about what arises. Some things do not need to be resolved immediately. Some simply need to be seen.